let's get to this, Brian. I wanted to first talk about the recent attack on Crimea. The Ukrainian Air Force, or what's left of it, did conduct a missile attack. It was reported by Sky News and others that this attack used Storm Shadow missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. Could you talk about the significance of this attack? Because the Western mainstream media is reporting this as almost like a breakthrough, something that shows that Ukraine is certainly not finished in this conflict. What is your take on it? How do you see this attack in terms of its significance on the battlefield and perhaps even more broadly than that?
Oh, it's very similar to during Desert Storm when Iraq managed to get some lucky Scud missile attacks in. It wasn't going to change the outcome, not even remotely. It had no impact on, say, America or its coalition partners' combat power, and the same applies to this attack. In order for these type of attacks to have an impact on Russian combat power, it would have to be happening several times a week. This is once or twice a month, these type of attacks. The last attack like this was, I think, about 2 weeks ago, that airfield where they destroyed two, maybe damaged several other of these transport planes, which Russia continuously manufactures. And this attack on Crimea, Sevastopol, the naval facility, this was a dry dock facility. There were two naval vessels, supposedly a submarine, a diesel-electric Kilo-class submarine, and a landing ship. Neither one of these were participating in the military operations. They were in dry dock. Usually you put a ship in dry dock for months at a time. They were being refitted, and depending on how much damage, they'll either be repaired or they have to clear them out and build new ships, which Russia is capable of doing. Conversely, Ukraine has no meaningful navy. They have these naval drones. Russia has naval drones. They have no ships. Their air force is depleted. I think they took out possibly an S-300 or S-400 launcher, or maybe a radar system, because when they say S-400 or S-300 system, they don't explain that it's actually numerous vehicles, and they probably only hit one of several vehicles in the system. And they celebrate this as a major victory when in reality, Russia has completely devastated Ukraine's air defense systems. Their Soviet-era S-300s have been wiped out, more or less. That's why the West is sending their air defense systems to Ukraine, and in inadequate numbers. So what it really is a distraction away from the failed offensive, failed or failing, depending on whether you want to put yourself out there and say that has officially failed. It is not making the progress that they claimed that it would. It is 3 full months of fighting going on to 4 months of fighting, and they have not even broken through the first of Russia's major defense lines. They're working their way through the security zone. And so they need something to distract away from this failure. And that is what these attacks are meant to do. The U.S. threatening Russia to send things like ATACMS, or Germany sending additional air-launched cruise missiles, Taurus. This is all, again, depending on your point of view, it could seem as if the West is desperate to try to send a war-winning capability to Ukraine, which none of these are. Or it could be a way of trying to pressure Russia to capitulate in one way or another. Not completely, I don't think the West imagines that, but maybe go to the negotiation table, maybe freeze the conflict. That would suit NATO, the United States, and the rest of NATO quite well, because then they could rearm Ukraine, just as they did from 2014 onward, using the Minsk agreements as a smokescreen. So I think that's really where we are and what these attacks represent.
Yeah, well, the attack, there's been narratives bandied about by various players in this. Ukraine has, of course, committed to waging this conflict for Crimea, never giving up the fact that Crimea long ago voted itself into the Russian Federation. But the United States and the collective West has taken a very, how should I say, bipolar almost position on this. On the one hand, they often say, well, we're not 100% into the retaking of Crimea. But on the other hand, they supply weapons and oftentimes just go along with what the Ukrainian military, with what Zelensky or whoever is saying about taking back Crimea. So, one, do you feel like these attacks on Crimea can increase? Like, does Ukraine have the ability to actually do more of this and perhaps pressure Russia to the negotiating table? Because I've heard many people say that, or at least smarter people, for example, like Alexander Makuris say, smarter people on this conflict in the mainstream media, they say, like, maybe this is a way to look good at the negotiating table. Like, look at what we can do once you get there, come from a position of strength. Do you see that as a possibility here, that Ukraine could even step these kind of attacks up as the conflict moves into this frozen territory on the battlefield, on that front line?
I agree with that. And yes, Alexander Makuris and Alex Christoforou discussed this often on their program, that these weapons that are being sent, the threat of sending ATACMS, the German Taurus, which is similar to the Storm Shadow and Scalp, they're not meant to win the war. Obviously, they cannot win the war, but they're there to put pressure on Russia, again, ahead of negotiations, or to try to draw them into negotiations and for some reason agree to freezing the conflict. And we saw provocations like this. And to answer your question, yes, Ukraine has the capability of doing this. This is basically the only thing they can do, are these highly visible stunts that don't change the overall fighting, will not change the overall outcome of the fighting, but create these headlines and make Russia look bad, and make people backing Russia angry and impatient, and giving false hope to people who are rooting on Ukraine. That's really the only thing that they can do. So I think they will continue focusing on this. The offensive has been a complete failure. So they're going to continue to do this. They have these capabilities, these long-range cruise missiles. They may get these ATACMS, these ballistic missiles, instead of using them in conjunction with their offensive to actually try to enhance their offensive capabilities. They're using them for these kind of PR stunts.
And how about Russia? On Russia's side, how does Russia view these attacks? And does Russia have the ability, given that the narrative now in the Western mainstream media with the counteroffensive is that, well, Russia learned from its mistakes? I believe that's a pretty wrong-headed narrative. But if we take that narrative and put it onto the situation with Crimea, and that these attacks have increased, does Russia have the capability of beating these back as well, to the point where they become almost as irrelevant as Ukraine's constant grind on that front line and the counteroffensive? Like, how do you see Russia's response thus far and its possibilities in the future?
Well, I think for Crimea and for the Sevastopol naval facility, and this is a vulnerable target. They have air defense. They're going to shoot down the majority of these missiles. But when you launch, say, 10 missiles all at one time, there's the possibility that a few will get through. They always will. No air defense is 100% effective. There really is nothing that Russia can do as far as that. But what they can do is realize that they have immense combat power that is generated from across the entirety of the Russian Federation, not just the Crimean Peninsula. They can weather these attacks. They can weather these attempts to humiliate them and pressure them. And again, we saw the exact same thing all throughout the Syrian conflict from 2015 onward, when the Syrian government invited Russia to intervene. We saw multiple attempts to humiliate Russia, to provoke Russia, and Russia never took the bait. They were patient, they were resolute, they saw it through to the end, to the point where now it's the United States clinging to its existence in the Middle East, not just in Syria, but across the wider region. The dynamics there in the region have changed because of Russia's patience and its perseverance, its inability to be provoked. And I think they're going to use the same formula regarding this conflict in Ukraine, although it's going to make a lot of people upset. A lot of ordinary people see this and they say, why isn't President Putin doing more? It's much more complicated than just focusing solely on the battlefield, solely on stopping these attacks. There are so many other factors to consider, and it's not just Moscow playing politics. You have to take in consideration all of these factors in order to actually win. And if you do anything short of winning, ultimately you will lose more lives. So it's because some people will say, well, you're squandering human lives by allowing this to drag on. But if you try to speed it up, if you cave in and allow yourself to be provoked, you can create a situation that's actually much worse for the people you're trying to protect.
We'll talk more about that, because what do you feel like are some of these factors? You know, when it comes to this conflict, it is a conflict not between Russia and Ukraine in some kind of vacuum. It is one that is fully backed and initiated really by NATO. So what are these factors? Because obviously the rationality or lack thereof of the United States-led NATO alliance has something to do with the way that this conflict is fought, I take it. But what's your take?
There's a lot of factors beyond the actual battlefield in Ukraine, or trying to protect the infrastructure, the military or civilian infrastructure in Crimea. There's the rest of the civilian population all across the Russian Federation. Then there are the allies of Russia, countries like India or China. And I've said this many times before. If Russia went in full throttle in February 2022, it would have been much more difficult to convince India, China, and many other nations to lean in Russia's direction. And it would have been very hard to convince other nations to lean over in their direction afterward, which we've seen many nations since do. They're doing that specifically because of the patience and the measured pace that Russia is using to execute this special military operation. It's a special military operation. It's not a total war. And this is what makes it possible for Russia to circumvent the sanctions. That is another factor, the economic situation that Russia is in, circumventing Western sanctions, building up economic ties with other nations around the globe, investing in multipolarism as this conflict continues, and actually using the conflict, again, as Alexander Mercouris pointed out, as a catalyst to accelerate the rise of multipolarism. So all of these are factors that Russia has to take into consideration. And another very important one, the West itself. If Russia allows itself to be provoked and it does something rash, people say, what, you know, Russia should get revenge against the UK for supplying these cruise missiles to Ukraine. Well, imagine if Russia did exact revenge against the UK in a very direct way. It would give the British government, the European Union, the respective governments within the European Union and the US the ability to further mobilize their populations. Right now, Danny, I mean, you're in the United States. Can you imagine under any condition the U.S. being able to fully mobilize the American people for Ukraine? At this point, I would probably venture a guess and say no. But there are things that Russia could do to provoke, to give the governments across the collective West ammunition to mobilize their population. Russia doesn't want that. They have the advantage in military industrial outputs, militarily, strategically, economically, diplomatically. They have all of the cards in their hand. Why would they jeopardize that by allowing themselves to be provoked?
Yeah, I mean, there was this recent, I don't know if you caught it. I think it was the United War College, or was it the Army College in the United States, that has published a report about the lessons of the Russia-Ukraine war, as they call it, and it literally states that there's a lot of issues with the U.S. military. You've talked about this. And if there's lessons to be learned from this conflict, it's that perhaps the United States needs to start thinking about not only renewed ways and revamped ways of recruiting, but also potentially partial conscription. So, that's kind of that's a trend, in terms of this idea. I think this is a trend in the West of, do we have the people power to be able to wage full-scale conflicts like the one that Ukraine is trying to wage with its NATO suppliers on the battlefield? It's increasingly unlikely.
Absolutely. There's so many fundamentals that have been neglected across the collective West in terms of waging large-scale, intense, and protracted warfare. Because, again, over the decades, the West has transformed their militaries to fight these small wars around the developing world, knocking over nations that don't even have standing armies, or who have armies poorly equipped, poorly trained. So that's what they've been doing for decades. And it is not that easy, as people might imagine, to simply transform your military back into a force capable of large-scale combat against a peer or near peer competitor. This is what the West is now realizing. Oh, wait, we don't have the ability to churn out artillery ammunition to supply Ukraine to even match, let alone exceed, what Russia is firing at them. That is a huge problem. It's, by the way, an unsolvable problem. Not in the immediate or even intermediate future will the collective West be able to manufacture enough artillery shells to supply Ukraine to do that. I was just reading a New York Times article finally admitting to all of these shortcomings, not just in artillery shell production, but missile production, tank production. It turns out that despite Western sanctions, Russia's military-industrial output is enormous. It is much larger than the collective West's, and it is getting larger still. How do you win a proxy war like this against Russia if that's the case? And the answer is you don't. So we're watching them do the exact same thing they did in Syria, which was trying to distract and provoke Russia because nothing else was going to work. The United States had no way of winning its proxy war in Syria once Russia intervened. They have absolutely no way of winning this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia at all. And so the only way is to try to trip up Russia, and Russia simply isn't going to take the bait.
Yeah, and I also think that the longer that this conflict goes on in this way, what we've seen similar to Syria is that the narrative control and narrative management, the ability in the public relations sphere to make this conflict out to be what the collective West says it is, has eroded dramatically. It happened in Syria. It was a freedom fighter-led war, almost like the Mujahideen, the famous picture of the Mujahideen sitting down with Ronald Reagan. These are our freedom fighters, similar to Washington and Franklin and whatnot. That's what Reagan said. And Syria 2011, there was supposed to be protests, and the Syrian government brutally cracked down. That's why they had to be sent weapons. That's why there was an armed conflict there. And then over the course of the years, you find out, well, actually, these were armed jihadist militants supplied by NATO, supplied by Israel, etc., to Saudi Arabia, etc., to wage proxy war inside of Syria. Now, you made a good point, Brian. I just want, before maybe to close on this particular subject, over the course of this conflict, I think that Ukraine itself, in the collective West, as well, have continued to expose how this conflict is not about some kind of war for democracy or anything like that. And I want your reaction to this. You mentioned India and China. The longer that this conflict has gone on, we can see that Russia has been able to strengthen its relations with India and China, so much so that it triggers Ukraine. And here's Mr. Podolyak, one of Zelensky's top advisors, who shot himself in his own foot, and said that uh, China and India have low intellectual potential. This angered both sides, India and China, with Mao Ning saying, hey, explain yourself, please, because that's a very charged comment, to say the least. And of course, he denied it. But as he continued talking, he said, they do not analyze the consequence of their own moves. These countries, unfortunately, have low intellectual potential. That was the original comment. And then he tried to walk it back, but said the global world is much broader, and even the most awful regional national interests. The global world is based on stability, predictability, rationality, and strategy on international law and clear rules of the game, insinuating that these countries do not follow that, especially by maintaining relations with Russia. But this is kind of like just saying that that India and China have low intellectual potential simply because they refuse to give up their neutrality on the conflict, I think has exposed this more and more as, as a proxy war. And so what's your reaction to not only those comments, but also how Russia has been able to play this out in the public relations sphere to make significant gains? And I think significant gains have been made in that area.
Well, I think comments like this reveal the reality of what the post-2014 Ukrainian government has been. It is a regime infested with Nazi ideology, racism, race theory, where the white race is superior, even though they're all Slavs. They pretend somehow that they aren't. They live in a fantasy world. It is 2023, and he even thought of saying something like this. What is wrong with him, and how is he in a position of power, even a pretend position, like the Kiev regime is? It's a client regime. It is a puppet regime. Couldn't they find someone more presentable? And the answer is no. And this is the problem the United States has consistently all around the globe. The only people willing to sign up to work with the United States are people like this in every single country, whether it's Nazi-inspired racists in Ukraine or violent thugs and mass murderers here in Southeast Asia. The worst of the worst seem to be attracted to working with the U.S., while the rest of these countries that are being targeted, they have the actual the actual people who keep the country running. And when you empower these people over the ordinary people that are actually maintaining a nation state, that is when your nation state falls apart, as Ukraine is. As we see every country the U.S. interferes in and installs a client regime in, we see this collapse because these people are incapable of running a country. The U.S. is not interested in running the country for them. They're interested in taking it and using it and then disposing of it. We've seen this over and over again. Ukraine is just the most recent example. And yes, it does. When he makes comments like this, it just makes it so much easier for Russia to make its case that this really is the West waging a proxy war, not just against Russia, but eventually it's going to expand into China. We've always talked about this, Danny, for a very long time. There already is a proxy war against China ongoing, but it'll continue to expand. And what is going on in Ukraine against Russia is just one part of a much wider strategy the West has been pursuing for decades to encircle and contain both Russia and China and everything along their collective peripheries. So you're absolutely right, and it just makes it for Moscow. It makes it so much easier for them to promote multipolarism, because look at the alternative.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.